So this little article was written several years ago and is a little bit out of date. And things have moved, if anything, in favour of the arguments of really going back to what our grandparents knew. If at the end of this talk anybody is interested to go into more detail about what I'm talking about, the full article is available on the Devon Hedge group. And if necessary, my email is just here below. Okay, right, next page. Okay, so our farm is about 400 acres. It's a low intensity organic grass farm, and we act as a feeder farm for a bigger organic dairy farm. Field sizes vary enormously from 1 to 30 acres. We're very high for Dorset. We're 400 to 1,000 feet. We have 12 miles of hedgerows, 10 miles managed under a 15, 20-year coppice rotation. The other 2 miles are roadside and therefore have to be flailed. But our hedgerows are growing at a below average rate. And so if you're on better ground and lower ground, the figures should be better for you. Okay, a small firewood business. Next page. Well, that was the question I asked myself. I think it was about 3 years ago. A lot of work's been done looking at hedge coppicing. I think it was under the Cordial project. I went over to Brittany myself, and they tend to use whole chip systems and use entire trees going through massive chippers to create biomass. This is the most efficient and economic way of doing it. And I acted as an assistant to a consultant for a biomass power station in South Wales. And they, because of the rising cost of biomass from forestry arisings, they were looking at harvesting hedgerows, initially neglected hedgerows, and then hopefully later on promoting hedgerows that have been let grow. So they were looking at 2,000 or 3,000 tons a week from hedges. It was really in its infancy, but the problem was the amount of management time due to the very fragmented supply chain. The issue really for hedges is the type of chip they produce. And if power stations could burn this, if you like, rough chip, then it would be very significant because it would establish a base price in the market. So what I'm going to show you here, I'm not trying to say this is what people should do. I just hope that there might be something of interest that you might either want to apply yourselves or even perhaps think about doing in the future. If it has any use, it's in its ordinariness. It doesn't require any special skill set, doesn't require any special machinery. It may or may not require labor, but I hope that I'll be able to show that if you need labor, then it can cover its cost. And the other thing is it requires very little capital. So if you're prepared to scrimp and save and use secondhand machinery, there's no reason why you can't have a 300-ton log business spending about £20,000 on capital, plant and trucks and so on. Many farms will have some of this equipment already. So if you wanted to go into this, then it's very capital light in farming terms. So I suppose the point I'm trying to make is it's really accessible to anybody. It doesn't require large capital sums. Okay, so, well, who doesn't like a nice heap of logs? So that's what we're producing and selling. for my own reasons, I don't particularly like kiln dried. I like to be a year ahead using big airy barns, and we don't have any problem getting it down below 20% moisture. Obviously, oak takes longer, birch takes less, but on the whole, it's not an issue so long as you've got enough ventilation. So if we go on to the next one, we'll see how it's sold. Okay, so where do we get the firewood from? Well, a certain amount comes out of the hedges. There is an issue with hedgewood in that the public don't like a lot of the material that comes out because they tend to like bigger material and they like it split. But all in all, I suppose we are harvesting some of our neighbours, so maybe 25 miles of hedgerows on a 15, 20-year rotation. We get given fallen trees. We do a bit of tree surgery work. We work in a coppice wood. We do forestry thinnings. And if we can't keep up, then we buy in loads of firewood from the timber companies. All of the figures I'm going to give you a little bit out, but the principles will all hold true as both income and costs have risen roughly in tandem. So the gross income might be about 30,000 for this type of business. Okay, thank you. Okay, so what do we produce? I'll be drilling down into really just the hedge products. So we produce some saleable material, certain amount, and then what I call ugly sticks. Now, these are, you will all be familiar with this type of material that comes out of hedges. It's small diameter, irregular, but nonetheless, biomass is biomass. On our farm, we tend to sell it sometimes to holidaymakers who want to have fires, but most of it we use ourselves. I think at the last count, we had 9 log burners, something like that. There's 4 generations of us on the farm, and different parts of hedge material go into different sorts of log burners, including a small glamping business. So we never have too many ugly sticks. We use it all. Okay, so the other thing we produce is nets of little cobs, I call them. They're like, they would resemble dry cow cubes, if you're familiar with what they look like a nut. And these come from hazel rods and that type of material that you get in hedges. To do that, I use a branch logger. There's some great YouTube videos of the branch loggers for those of you that aren't familiar with them, which I could recommend. So I bought my branch logger from the Czech Republic. They're ideal, these little nuts, for tiny log burners in boats, yurts, shepherd's huts, that sort of thing. And the other thing we make is from the selected species, i.e. hand-friendly species with no thorns, we make nets of kindling. So when these branch loggers are working, if you have 2 men feeding the branch logger and the material is well laid out from the hedge and we sort it as we're working, then we make nets of kindling twigs. And these are becoming more popular with some people, but some people don't like them because it's untidy. That picture there is how many ugly sticks you get out of 220 meters of hedge. Okay, thank you. Okay, right. If you decided you wanted to go down this road, I would think I made the mistake of letting all my hedges go, and some of them had just too high a percentage of thorn in them, and looking back, it was a mistake. So if you were thinking in these terms of letting your hedges grow, then select a hedge that has a lot of decent log material in it, and you know, arguably you wouldn't do a hedge which had a lot of thorn and holly in it. So this hedge that I selected for this article was 220 meters long, 15-foot wide and 20-foot high, and on a typical hedge bank. Our part of Dorset is really, in terms of landscape, integrated with Devon, not with the chalk ground on further into Dorset. Our environment isn't particularly friendly for tree growth. Its average altitude, this hedge was 600 feet above sea level, high wind speeds and poor soil. When I stopped flailing it some 20 years ago, it was double fenced with old barbed wire. It was half a mile from the processing site and the abstraction access was good. As foresters, you'll know that abstraction is key. So if you were selecting a hedge to let it grow, think about abstraction and distance from processing site. Okay, thank you. Okay, ironically, the very first thing I do when I go into one of these big hedges is I go in with a flail, a tractor mounted flail. And what that does is I dip in and out of the hedge and smash up the bramble heaps, because that is so depressing and time killing, and to do that by hand. And the flails really smash it up. And obviously we take down the old fences as we come across them inside the hedge. When you're coppicing a hedge, some people will make the mistake of using a big saw. I'm not quite sure about whether I'm supposed to, but I like to use a 2-kilogram climbing saw, which I can handle easily with one hand. And I've got my other hand free to move stuff around. And I think every kilo really counts if you're using a chainsaw all day. So as we're working, we separate the hedge into all these different products, so we don't have to go back over it. So we're looking for, as the stuff is coming out, we're separating it into the various things that we think it's going to end up as. It gives us an opportunity to tidy up the standards. We will actually have a very high tree standard density in our hedges, with a view to harvesting some of the standards in later rotations. It just gives us more going on in the hedge. And I like the idea that stuff is happening in 3D, if you like, rather than 2D. So we tend to have standards at maybe 20 meters rather than 40 meters, something like that. I would say that one of the nicest things about letting hedges grow is that you usually are spoilt for choice for 20-foot high first rotation standards, because they're in there, they're forced up nice and straight by all the rubbish growing around them. And you just come across a very nice straight 20-year-old oak tree, which when you've cleared everything else away is quite a nice sight. Okay, so selected brash and rods were processed using the branch logger. We still had a lot of brash, and we weren't able to sell all the viable brash as kindling twigs. We were able to we can sell about a third of it, but I'm hopeless at marketing and selling things, so people could probably do better, but I'm not sure that they could sell all the tops of all the viable species. The stuff was brought back and processed, bigger stuff with a log splitter, smaller stuff with a saw bench. The ugly sticks were either cut long for holiday makers to have fires, or short for our own log burners. The stuff is all stored for about a year to get it down to 20%. Okay, thank you. Right, so what did this 220 meters produce? I did weigh it off, and I know how much my materials handler bucket has. So these weights are about right. We had 9 tons of saleable logs, 6 tons of ugly sticks, 99 nets of cobs, and 260 nets of kindling twigs. But we couldn't go on producing that amount of kindling twigs from all the hedges we do because we wouldn't have a market. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I set off to, I asked myself this question far too late in the day because I've been doing it for a long time, but I never actually worked out whether it was sensible or not. So all the figures I'm going to give you are done with a view to people having a living wage. And I've worked it out at what I would charge people to go and work on their farms. And they have altered a bit, but as I said, they're not significantly different. So we spent about 2 hours initially flailing this. So that was just dipping in out, smashing up the brambles, really. The actual coppicing work took 88.5 hours, and I put a man with a chainsaw in at £15 an hour. The branch logger was £30 an hour, but it's because we had at least 2 men on it. I should make the point here that we tend to use very low horsepower tractors. One, because it's not good for big farm tractors to be doing such light work. It tends to clog up the engines and carbonated the pistons. So we use a little 3-stroke 30 horsepower Japanese tractor, which we find is very good on fuel, but also is not, it's running onto power, if you like. So then taking all the nets and things back to the processing site and storage site, abstraction of the cordwood, I put that in at £30 an hour because we were using a materials handler. It took me 5 hours to burn up the brash. Again, I was using a materials handler to do that. So processing of saleable material and ugly sticks, that's just the time it took us to chop it up. And the delivery cost, it varies, but we don't tend to travel further than about 3 miles from the farm. And I think that's about right for the cost of delivery in terms of time. So it came to a pretty scary £3,300 to do the work. Okay, thank you. Okay, so when I first started thinking about this, it occurred to me that possibly there was really a very significant saving to be made in simply not flailing. So I spoke to 3 or 4 of my farming friends, and as a great favor, they worked out their flailing cost per meter, which I averaged out, and it came to 35p a meter a year. So we ended up, if we say hadn't flailed this hedge for 15 years, and it was 220 meters long, it gives us a saving of £1,100 or so. Oh, it's clearly dependent on the size of the hedge and how many times you have to do the passes with the hedge trimmer. But this is not far out for the southwest, who have, you know, we have wonderful hedges down here, and if you've got a mean little thorn hedge, I don't think any of it would work. Okay, so kindling twigs. This is what we sell it for by weight, but do bear in mind that we don't manage to sell as much as we could make. So that's just to be borne in mind with that. These little nets of cobs are easy to sell, and people who use them like them because, you know, these very small top loading log burners. The ugly sticks, I put them in at £150 a ton. We tend to use most of them ourselves, but I never have never have too many of them. I don't have any problem putting them to use, and the saleable logs were fine, and they get mixed up with material from everywhere else. There may be a coppicing grant of £4 a metre, but we'll come on to talking about that later on. So if there was a coppicing grant of £4 a metre, you could be looking at about a profit of about £10 a metre. Okay, thank you. Okay, me and my son often do this together, and in this modern world, it's one of the few places where youth and strength still matter a lot. So my son's output is probably twice as much as mine. So the coppicing rate of the worker is important. I mean, what I like about it at my age is I can do half a day and go home, and that's probably the best solution, because if I try and stay there all day, I'm just sat down being annoying. I do appreciate that a lot of farmers and foresters are very busy, and I think that the figures will allow a farmer to, or a landowner, to pay somebody a living wage to do this sort of work. A lot will depend on the nature of the hedge. So if you're going to let them grow, I urge you to carefully look at the ones you're thinking about quite carefully. This is a picture of the hedge just after it was finished that spring, and all you'll see is a hedge bank with some standards and some bluebells. I have sent a picture, which may or may not come up, of what it looked like 2 years later. Oh, there it is. So there's a lot of concern with coppicing because it looks so brutal, but this is what it looked like taken. It's the same hedge, and that's 2 years of hedge growth. So, coppicing does actually, I would say it's not as good as laying, and I don't want to get into that debate. And I would take every metre of laying that we can get. I love it on so many levels, but coppicing is just a little bit quicker. And in what I'm talking about, speed is the thing. Okay, thank you. Right, next picture. Next, that's it. Okay, so what are the disadvantages to letting your hedges grow? You get shading. You can get some crop retardation near the hedges because of the significant root systems. You lose about 2 or 3 meters each side of the hedge bank as the hedges grow. And towards the end of the rotation, depending on what species you've got, you might get things falling into the field. Willow is a particular sinner on that front. So if you're growing very high value crops, it may not be a good idea to let your hedges grow. Okay, thank you. I've mentioned the coppicing grant, but actually I'd like to just, since this was done, it has moved in favour of letting your hedges grow, because I think, as I understand it, under the SFI that's coming, there will be grants available to let your hedges grow under different things. Now, I'm absolutely hopeless at all of the subsidy systems and everything, but I believe they are readily available, and there would be people who would know, in detail about what money is available for what thing. But if you were going to let them grow, this could be a very vital aspect of the finances of letting them grow. So I said here, this was just it was just Brexit had just happened. It will increase natural capital. There may be other aspects of hedgerow, letting your hedges grow, that in the future, in terms of carbon sequestration and farm carbon audits, they may be of use to a farm in that way. So yes, I mean, that's just repeating myself. If the farmer, there will be a lot of farms, I think, that are going to be really struggling when we lose BPS, especially actually some of the more attractive farms that the public think they would like. So I'm talking about extensive livestock farms on the edge of the moors. I think they're going to be really up against it when we lose our area payments. And in a sense, you know, if you have the time, and a lot of farmers don't, it would be better to go and do a little bit of hedging rather than sit in the kitchen and worry about the farm. You would be making a very modest amount of money, but at least you'd be out there, your farm would be looking good, and you'd be earning a little bit of money. So with the money that we're looking at, you could probably employ a coppicer, and you would probably still save the cost of flailing on this basis. Thinking about it here, the reason that I can subject you to these figures is we feed this material through our little log business, and this won't be possible for everybody, but then other people will develop other models which they may be able to incorporate hedge material. You have the benefit of having hedges of all different sizes, and I won't go into the wildlife aspect of it because I'm certainly not an expert, but it is very nice to see all the different flowers and animals that use the hedges from right down to the dirt to 30, 40 foot high. So in terms of the economy, you're producing sustainable renewable energy, and you're producing it and it's being consumed locally. Okay, thank you. In terms of energy output, in terms of viable heat, it produced about 88 megawatt hours of usable heat energy. I'm particularly interested in trying to make a personal tiny contribution to fighting global warming. So I worked out that this 220 meters of hedge over its 15 years of growth produced the same amount of heat as 8,500 liters of heating oil. So we've got some semi-permanent carbon sequestration in the significantly bigger root systems that will lock the carbon down under the soil. You'll have increased leaf fall, so the leaves get dragged in by the earthworms and the carbon is then drawn in. It will also help with diffuse pollution and things like that. So the other aspect of it is in some senses, hedges although they're vital to how a landscape looks, many people sort of hardly notice them, although we certainly notice them when they're not there. You know, if you drive through Picardy or somewhere like that and there are no hedges, it's a big open country. So it would increase I think it would increase the beauty of the countryside. The potential scale for hedges to add to the rural economy and is actually quite considerable. So if we said 5% of the hedges in the country were allowed to grow and then were harvested and coppiced, I see here, I never actually did do the maths, but this 220 meters of hedge and all the figures that apply to it would increase by some 113,000 times, given that there's something like 500,000 miles of hedgerows in England. Okay, thank you. I just sort of feel that if we can turn hedges from being considered a cost and something that we're legally obliged not to destroy into an asset, you know, they will have a much better chance of being decent hedges into the future. Okay, thank you. Oh, and that was just a picture of the saleable material. I'd just like to finish really with a few observations about what's going on at the moment. I took on a young woman who lost her job during COVID, and she really enjoys this sort of work. And she would like to find employment and a life in the countryside. And working in forestry or hedges in the winter months gives her an opportunity to create a living for herself. And I think there is a possibility that a whole new type of young person could come back into the countryside as hedge farmers. And I think that one thing that as foresters that you might consider, and the biggest problem that a new generation of people with no significant capital behind them have, is processing sites. So I think that if in some way it suited you or it was possible, it would be something for you to consider as one of the biggest blocks on young people entering the countryside to do this sort of work. I mean, how you'd go about it would be, you know, some of you might be interested in log banks. There was a very interesting article on Radio 4 about a log bank in Northumbria, or you might be interested in going into business with them or whatever, but there would be lots of ways of skinning that particular cat. I'd just like to just really finish by making a few points about, there are lots of comments about particulates and burning wood, and I don't know too much about any of that, but I'd just like to make some points in favor of burning wood. I think if you're going to economically value firewood, you must put it against the highest price at the peak of the electricity surge, you know, on any given day, because that's when wood comes into play. So if you get a cold, still day in the winter when it's dark, which is, you know, usually when it's very cold, it's still, the turbines aren't turning. And we all go out by the tens of thousands to our log sheds, get our logs in and light our fires. So it comes on tap just at the critical moment for the grid. And I think that's very significant. And the reason I think it's significant is not just about the highest cost price, but it is very hard to store renewable energy. And I think logs, you know, virtually never mentioned. You hear a lot about industrial battery storage for smoothing the grid and power stations on standby. But actually, the unremarkable little log burner with us all going to our sheds, you know, that is a wonderful way of smoothing out renewable energy supply. I know it's only small potatoes, probably well under 1% of the whole system, but given it's such a vast economy, even 1% is still a very significant business. So just to say at the end, if we get active and make use of our woody resources, it's good for the countryside, good for the working people in the countryside, and good for the economy, and actually good for the wildlife and nature as well. So thank you very much.